Hello, my name is Dr. Jacob Gran, and in this video I'm going to give a walkthrough of Schenker's graphic analysis for the chorale Ich bin's, ich sollte büßen from J.S. Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Let's start by listening to the chorale. The melody in the soprano was a pre-existing Lutheran chorale, and Bach composed the other three voices. As we listen, pay attention to the ends of the phrases, demarcated with fermatas, and notice the degrees of melodic and harmonic closure at each of these cadences. Here are the first few levels of Schenker's graph. When a graph has more than one level, they are vertically aligned to allow easy comparison. Most of what we do when we interpret a graph such as this one is to compare adjacent levels, starting at the top and working our way down towards the foreground. There is a common misconception that Schenker asks us to ignore or discount foreground tones. Arnold Schoenberg once looked at one of Schenker's graphs and said something along the lines of, "But where are all my favorite notes?" Ah yes, there they are, the little tiny black ones. In reality, the whole point of preparing a linear analysis is to explain the details of a composition in terms of the context provided by the surrounding structure. Getting to the foreground is the whole point, but it might take many levels to get there. As an analogy, imagine you are back in English class, and you are asked to diagram the sentence, "Cut the red wire quickly." Clearly, it is important that it be the red wire, and not the blue or the green wire, and that whoever is being spoken to cut that red wire as soon as possible. So, from the perspective of the people who are having this conversation, the words red and quickly are maybe the most important words in the sentence. But from the perspective purely of grammar, they are low-level modifiers. The same is true of Schoenberg's favorite notes. Musically and artistically, they may be completely indispensable. But from an analytic perspective, their voice-leading roles are determined by the linear context provided by other tones. Let's start at the top of the graph. Schenker labels this level simply ersatz, and then shows us a three-line ersatz in the key of A flat. This is going to be the framework for understanding the succeeding levels. You might notice that this presentation of the ersatz doesn't include structural beams, which Schenker usually uses to show the ersatz in his other analyses. Why did he choose to show this level in undifferentiated whole notes? More on that later as we work our way down the graph. Directly below the ersatz is the erste Schicht, or first level. This level shows two ways in which Bach composed out the previous level. First, an interruption breaks the structure into two halves. Second, a neighbor note D flat is added to the primary tone C in the second half of the structure. This is counterpointed with an octave D flat, which we know serves as a structural predominant harmony because of the doubly curved slur underneath it. The return to the head tone C is now displaced compared to where it occurred in the previous level. It now occurs above the bass E flat, forming a second species 6/5 motion above the dominant. At this level, Schenker uses beams for the fundamental line in the upper voice, but not for the bass arpeggiation. Notice how Schenker also chooses to attach the neighbor note D flat to the beamed upper voice structure. Schenker would expect us to know that the neighbor note plays a subordinate role compared to the other tones of the fundamental line, even though he groups them all together visually equally as part of the same beam structure. It must be subordinate because it can't be traced back to the previous level. The next level has a lot of new information, but we can make sense of it by comparing this level to the previous one. To orient ourselves, let's identify where the tones from the previous level show up at this level. Let's start with the bass line. The initial A-flat is easy to spot. This tonic is prolonged by a Kopplung Abweg, which means descending coupling, and Schenker indicates this with a dashed slur. The dividing dominant E-flat is still there, connected to the low A-flat by a slur, which Schenker labels Quintzug, or fifth progression. At this moment, we can see the relationship as a consonant skip of a fifth, the same function as the slur from the previous level. But at later levels, we will see how this interval is filled in by a stepwise diminution, which is usually what Schenker means when he uses the term Zug. The structural A-flat of the second half of the structure is harder to spot. It has been displaced way over here. Remember that Bach did not compose the melody for this composition, but only the other voices. So Schenker is trying to show us something he thinks is important about Bach's bass line and the way it interacts with the given chorale melody. When we look at how this A-flat connects to other structural bass tones from the previous level, we see that it connects backwards to two of the tones that we've just looked at. First, a dashed slur connects the low A-flat from the first half to this A-flat by what Schenker calls a Kopplung Aufweg, or ascending coupling. He wants to show that Bach undoes the earlier octave descent with a counterbalancing ascent that returns the tone A-flat to its original register. Second, a solid slur connects the dividing dominant from the first half of the form to this A-flat, which Schenker labels Quartzug, or fourth progression. Both of these tones existed at the previous level, but they were not directly connected to one another by any kind of slur. At this newest level, Schenker wants to show how the dividing dominant connects to the subsequent tonic through a stepwise ascent in the bass: E-flat, F, G, A-flat. This fourth progression overrides what would normally be a strong break in the voice leading at the interrupting dominant. Do you remember, as we listened, the varying levels of closure at the fermatas and at the ends of phrases in this piece? The voice leading of Bach's bass line continues right across these fermatas, and I think that is one reason why Schenker chose this short piece as his first example of graphing technique in the 5 graphic analyses. He only chose pieces that have interesting middle grounds. The final structural tonic is also pretty easy to spot. But what about the structural D-flat and E-flat of the final cadence? Schenker has altered how he represents these tones. At the first level, they were expressed using the open note heads of half notes, while at the second level, they are shown with closed note heads of quarter notes. Were these tones demoted in status between levels? No, not really, because when two graphic representations disagree with one another, the tie has to go to the deeper level, since the whole point of having the deeper levels is to clarify the more proximate levels. The bass D-flat is still the structural predominant, and the E-flat is still a part of the bass arpeggiation that counterpoints against the fundamental line. I think Schenker notates these tones as closed note heads because he wants us to compare the status of these two E-flats. Schenker had a complicated view on the interruption, but we can summarize by saying that he viewed the dividing dominant to be the structurally superior of the two background dominant chords. I think that's all he's trying to show, but I also doubt anyone would have complained if he had chosen to keep the later tones as open note heads. The second level also includes more rhythmic displacement at this cadence. Notice that Schenker uses diagonal lines to connect the upper voice D-flat and C to the bass tone D-flat, and underneath he uses figured bass symbols of an octave and a seventh in parenthesis. He's trying to show how both of the upper voice tones relate to the bass D-flat as a second species consonant octave and dissonant passing tone seventh, which have been rhythmically displaced backwards. As we'll see, that now accented passing tone ends up forming the chordal seventh of the predominant 4 chord at later levels. Now that we've identified where all of the bass tones from the first level show up at the second level, we can start to try to figure out how the new tones at this level relate back to them. The first thing that jumps out are the beams to certain structural bass tones that had been absent from the bass arpeggiations of the previous levels. Instead of using the beams to show the bass arpeggiation, Schenker uses beams to connect 4 instances of scale degree 1, A-flat. He also connects these tones with dashed slurs to indicate coupling. Coupling is a term that comes from the organ, where an organist might select, for instance, 8-foot and 16-foot stops for the same manual, so that playing this higher A-flat will also sound the lower A-flat. Schenker borrows that term to refer to the same background tone being expressed in different registers at the middle ground or foreground. As an aside, I'd like to point out that Schenker graphs this play of registers differently in his book Free Composition. While discussing the same 4 tones of this bass line, he represents the couplings instead using unfolding symbols. This is a lesson that is important for students to understand. The same underlying compositional relationships can be graphed in more than one way. It would be convenient for students learning to graph if every relationship had only one representation, but unfortunately that's not the case. In this case, Schenker wants to show that the relationship between the high and low A-flats is the composing out of an essentially harmonic relationship from the previous level. And that can be shown either as an unfolding of an octave, or by using the dashed slurs of a coupling. He might also have labeled the dashed slurs as descending and ascending register transfers, and he would have conveyed the same underlying concept. By the way, this is a good opportunity to explain why the unfolding symbol looks the way that it does. The idea of an unfolding symbol is that it's going to use a beam to connect tones that bear a harmonic relationship to one another at a deeper level. But the tones might also be connected to other melodic tones, and so the upper voice needs to have upward stems, and the lower voice needs downward stems. We attach new stems that go in the opposite direction, and then connect them with a slanted beam, in order to leave those original stems free to make other kinds of voice-leading connections. Looking back now, we can see that there was some method in the madness with respect to Schenker's use of the structural background beams. Because he wants to use the beams in the bass to indicate something unconventional, he avoids using beams at all at the level of the ersatz, introduces the upper voice beams at the next level down, and only introduces the unconventional beams once the basic structural tones of the baseline have already been clearly established. He doesn't want to use beams to show two different things at different levels of the same graph. Now let's look at the new tones that Schenker adds at this level, and see how they can be generated from the previous level. Within the first descending coupling, we see the new tones E flat and C generated as an arpeggiation through the tonic triad between the coupled A flats. Schenker breaks the arpeggiation into two different slurs, a slur from A flat to C, and then one from C to the low A flat. We understand Schenker's choice to break up the arpeggiation into two slurs when we compare the bass line to the upper voice, and notice that the bass tone C counterpoints against an important melodic point of arrival on A flat. More on that when we discuss the upper voice. But the point is that the two slurs of the bass represent motions that are paired with simultaneous motions in the other voice. Another arpeggiation generates the bass tone F between A flat and the structural predominant D flat in the final cadence. This is the bass tone that provides consonant support beneath the upper voice D flat and causes that rhythmic displacement that we discussed earlier. Finally, there are the tones of that middle fourth progression that I mentioned before. These are generated by a stepwise diminution connecting the dividing dominant to the high A flat. Schenker also adds the lower level E natural as an applied leading tone to the bass note F. Now let's turn our attention to the upper voice and how it compares to the previous level. The primary tone C is prolonged over the octave descent in the bass, indicated with a dashed slur that pairs against the dashed slur of the bass. This prolongation is accomplished by a motion into and out of an inner voice. Schenker shows this with two slurs, labeled Terzzug Abweg and Terzzug Aufweg, which, as you might guess, means descending third progression and ascending third progression, respectively. Notice how the soprano and alto voices form a third from A flat to C, and this interval defines and occupies what Schenker referred to as a tone space. The soprano voice descends to a unison A flat with the alto, and then ascends back to the retained primary tone C. And in so doing, it traverses and fills in that tone space. The same kind of counterbalancing motions of descending and ascending third progressions also prolongs the primary tone in the second half of the melody. The only difference being that the alto voice, instead of prolonging scale degree 1, as it had in the first half, now descends stepwise to scale degree 5. Notice also that Schenker clarifies the voice leading of the descending third progression using figured bass symbols that indicate the soprano and alto motions over the stationary bass tone F. Now let's compare the second level, which we've just studied, to the third level of Schenker's graph. The difference between these levels is not very large, only that these pairs of harmonic thirds from the previous level have been composed out as unfoldings. By detaching the tones of these harmonic thirds, they can now be used as goals of melodic motion at further levels of elaboration. Now let's compare the third level, one half at a time, to Schenker's foreground graph. This level has by far the most detail, and it resembles the score quite closely. Schenker labels this level the Erlinie Tafel, which literally means graphic analysis. But it's understood to more or less mean the foreground. In most other graphs, Schenker simply labels this level the foreground. But the Erlinie Tafel is conceptually distinct from the preceding levels for a number of reasons. First, Schenker includes bar lines and measure numbers, which were not included at the previous levels. Schenker in fact considered all of the previous levels to be arrhythmic, and therefore ametrical. Later music theorists disagree with Schenker on this point, but I do think it's important for understanding Schenker's perspective. For him, real meter and rhythm exist only at the foreground. Everything prior to that is an abstraction. Second, Schenker uses a mixture of analytic and standard notation at the foreground level. Notice, for instance, the use of dotted rhythms, open note heads that are actually representing half-note durations, and beams that actually represent eighth-note durations. It's as if Schenker has taken the analytic notation of his closest middle ground level and has overlaid it on top of the standard notation of Bach's score. All of the tones that are newly generated at this level are given in standard notation, but luckily they're fairly easy to understand in terms of the previous middle ground level. The first unfolding, for instance, is elaborated with smooth, stepwise motion that outlines the tonic triad, and the bass tones of the previous level are pretty easy to pick out in the foreground as well. The second unfolding is elaborated with an inner third progression, shown with a slur, where A flat is understood as a passing tone between the B flat and G. Schenker also places the soprano tone C and alto E flat in parenthesis to show that they don't participate in that particular inner third progression. They can instead be seen as incomplete neighbor figures. If Schenker had notated them with flagged stems, which is the normal way he showed incomplete neighbors, they may have been misunderstood as eighth-note durations written in standard notation. After the interruption, we see much the same story. The two unfoldings are elaborated in the same way as before, since the chorale tune is repeating in parallel at this point. Bach's bass line, though, is doing something quite different, especially during this span that elaborates the retained bass tone F. This passage, highlighted in purple, is one of the most perplexing in any graph by Schenker that I've encountered, so we'll take a minute to unpack it. Let's zoom in on this excerpt from the foreground. Looking at the upper voice, we see the same inner third progression as before, elaborating the unfolding from B flat to G. Schenker labels the chord under the A flat DG, meaning Durchgang, indicating that this chord has a passing function. So far, so good. The figured bass indicates parallel tenths between the outer voices for these three chords, and the first two are easy to identify, a tenth between B flat and G, and A flat and F. But what about that last interval between G and C? That's the largest tenth I've ever seen. If I didn't know any better, I'd say that that's a 12th. Schenker also beams the tones of this bass line together and labels the beam as a third progression, G, F, and C. In order to understand this passage as a third progression in the bass and parallel tenths between the outer voices, the final bass tone would need to be an E natural instead of C. To make matters just a little bit worse, Schenker also includes parallel octaves between the bass and tenor voices that are not there in Bach's actual composition. I'll return to the parallel octaves, but let's start by explaining the bass tone C. Schenker realizes that all of this is quite confusing, so he adds two new middle ground levels vertically aligned above this portion of the Erlenja-Tafel to provide clarification. We've been reading the graph from top to bottom so far, but now we need to take a detour and start reading upwards. The new middle ground shows the outer voice counterpoint with everything else stripped away. No bar lines, no unfolding symbols, or anything else. The first tenth in the sequence is this one between C and A flat in the outer voices, which are displaced in the original foreground graph. He puts the last tenth in parentheses, sort of admitting that something's off about them. Above this, Schenker shows the real prototype for the voice leading of this passage, a Dezimensatz, or progression of parallel tenths, between the outer voices. When we compare these two middle grounds, we see that between them, the bass and alto have traded notes. The bass E natural is swapped for the alto C. Schenker had a term for this. He called it the addition of a root. He would say that the natural voice leading of this passage would have led Bach to a first inversion C chord at this moment. But compositionally, Bach required the stronger root position chord beneath the fermata at the end of this phrase. So for harmonic reasons, he rearranged the chord so that the root appeared in the bass voice. Now, what about the parallel octaves? Schenker shows in his middle ground that the octave Fs are approached in contrary motion from a sixth, E natural moving up and G in the bass moving down. That sixth is displaced in the foreground graph. The inner voice D natural and E natural now both occur above the bass tone G, creating a second species 5-6 motion. Schenker encloses these bass tones, F and E, in parentheses, to show that they are not participating in the deeper voice leading of the passage. Schenker would say that the parallel octaves between the E's and F's are only apparent, since the two E naturals between the bass and tenor don't form a genuine harmonic octave. Instead, in his interpretation, the voice leading of the passage involves a sixth that moves with contrary motion to the octave. Our analysis isn't really finished until we compare Schenker's foreground to Bach's actual score. Here we notice that even the Erlinia Tafel is a slight reduction and rhythmic normalization compared to the score. Schenker leaves out, for instance, suspended tones in the alto voice, and very low-level neighbor notes and passing tones. But overall, these relationships are very obvious, and comparing the Erlinia Tafel to the score is probably even easier than comparing any of the previous levels to one another. One final thing to note is how Bach avoids the parallel octaves that we saw in Schenker's foreground graph. The contrapuntal line that Schenker notates in a single voice in the Erlinia Tafel is actually divided in Bach's score between the tenor and alto parts. If you ever feel like inducing a headache, sit for a while and reflect on the complexity of Schenker's interpretation of these two measures. That's everything that I have to say about this graph. I hope you found it instructive. Let's end the video by listening once again to the entire chorale, this time presented alongside Schenker's Erlinia Tafel.